Zoom is great for one-on-one conversations. Sometimes the other person makes a lot of sense. Then again, it does depend on who you're talking to. As a church congregation, we have been using Zoom to replace some of our face-to-face meetings. We hold virtual committee meetings. We meet together online for prayer. We worship together on Sunday mornings and listen to someone talking about the Bible. If you have never taken part in an online church service, details of how you might join us may be found on our website. You'd be very welcome. Zoom is great, but it does have its problems. Imagine having these 4 characters on a Zoom call. What would you like to ask them? Maybe, what are the Eggmen and the Walrus? And does Goo Bajoob mean anything? Or how about, will the broken-hearted people living in the world ever agree? And what do you do when John tells you to imagine something, but George won't stop interrupting? It's not like you can just mute one person. Well, not unless you're the host. And that might just be a little bit, well, rude. And what if we increase the number of participants to, let's say, 25 people wanting to talk all at the same time? It would be difficult to follow any conversation when other people kept jumping in and introducing their own topics. It gets worse then if you would expand it to, say, 49 people. You know, this makes me wonder about God. If you and I struggle with holding a Zoom call with relatively few people, how does God cope when thousands of people are crying out to him all at the same time? Or tens of thousands? Or millions? Or how does God cope on a Sunday morning, time zones notwithstanding, when billions are all demanding his attention? Well, the good news is that God is big enough to take care of all this. Psalm 139 tells us that he is intimately acquainted with what each one of us is getting up to at any moment in the day. Let me read to you the first 4 verses. Lord, says the psalmist, you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. In fact, Jesus tells us something very similar. He says that God knows what we're going to ask for in prayer even before we utter the words. Here's Matthew chapter 6 and verse 8. Your Father knows what you need before you ask him. So, how does God manage it? I struggle to hold a constructive conversation with a dozen people, and there he is interacting with millions upon millions. Well, to a large extent, we don't know how he does it. Just like, well, we don't know how to create life. Just like a unified theory of everything seems just as elusive as ever. In fact, people have struggled for millennia to describe and indeed define God, but he also can be just as elusive. We gain a hint in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8, which says, do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. Time stretches and time compresses in God's hands. Indeed, theologians say that God is outside time. I guess that's one way of coping with all of those conversations. Of course, a conversation is normally two-way. And in a Zoom call, you might get to see the other person on video. That said, sometimes all you get is a blank screen and a name. Maybe the other person couldn't figure out the technology, or maybe they just, didn't tidy up their room in time. It can feel that way sometimes with God. It can be easy to do all the talking and to forget the conversation is meant to be two-way. It's one of the key features of the Christian faith that God reaches for us just as we reach out for him. And God speaks to us. God speaks to us as we read his written word. God speaks to us in our dreams and in our musings. And sometimes we even hear his voice, whether audible or internal. God doesn't mute himself. And neither does God want to keep the video switched off. At the heart of the incarnation is the truth that God stepped down into human history in the person of Jesus Christ. Here's a verse from the New Testament, Colossians chapter 2, verse 9. In Christ, all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form. So, what is Jesus like? Well, these 9 characters behind me, they are all actors. I don't know if any one of them came close to capturing the appearance and indeed the personality of Jesus. And there's a sense in which it doesn't really matter. The best way to get to know someone is to talk with them, to do stuff together, to be open and frank about your lives together. It's good to talk. And let me close by challenging you to talk to God more. You don't even need an internet connection. You don't even need a computer. Make time to chat. Make time to listen. Because God can spare you all the time you need.